In the 90s, game developers went from teenage coders, hidden away in bedrooms and attics, to celebrities, buying Ferraris and even castles to support their rock star lifestyles. Lord British, John Romero, the Bitmap Brothers. But in the midst of it all, is a softly spoken man from Scotland who only wanted to write efficient programs and ride roller coasters while staying well out of the limelight. I'm talking, of course, about Chris Sawyer. Most people know Transport Tycoon as the first isometric game from the Sawyer stable, but Chris released an isometric title 10 years before this. In 1984, after programming a clone of Missile Command, he created Quogo for the Memotech MTX computer. Quogo was a clone of the popular arcade game Qbert, and isometric graphics weren't the only Sawyer hallmark it contained. It's following me, everywhere, even through history. In addition to isometric graphics, and a love of a 1970s LP featuring recordings of the Bressingham Voigt organ, Quogo had something else in common with Chris Sawyer's later games. Now, for most people who cut their teeth programming on an 8-bit computer or early PC, the language of choice was some dialect of BASIC. But BASIC is an interpreted language. Every line of code needs to be translated into simple instructions the computer's CPU can understand. On the primitive 8-bit CPUs of the time, this was painfully slow. To make something like Quogo smooth and fast on the MTX with its mere 4 MHz Z80 processor, Chris Sawyer needed to build his program directly using those simple instructions the CPU could understand. That meant no interpreter to slow things down, and no compiler using more instructions than necessary. This technique of writing a program using only instructions directly supported by the CPU is called assembly language. Quogo was followed by a sequel, Quogo 2. In fact, Chris Sawyer produced a huge number of Memotech games, either arcade clones or unique isometric titles, including Arcasion, Quasia, Chamberoids and Revenge of the Chamberoids, Sepulchre's Scelerati, Target Zone, and Escape from Zarkos. As was common for many of the teenage game programmers of the time, he made enough money to buy a printer, disk drive, and a few blank cassettes. That rock star lifestyle. While studying computer science at the University of Strathclyde, Chris Sawyer exchanged his trusty Memotech MTX 500 for an Amstrad CPC 6128, and then upgraded to an IBM-compatible Amstrad PC 1512. But even with a 16-bit CPU running at 8 MHz and more than 10 times the memory of the humble Memotech, it still needed to be programmed in assembly to extract the kind of performance required for games. Not that the PC was exactly teeming with games in those days. As anyone who was a PC gamer at the time will painfully remember, all the best games were on the Amiga and Atari, where they ran with colourful graphics and digitised sound, compared to the garish CGA and pitiful speaker bleeps and bloops of their PC counterparts. But publishers realised there was a market in converting these Amiga flagships to IBM's beige box of business. What they needed was the help of an expert in x86 assembler who could get to those fusty old PCs throwing around sprites with the same aplomb as the Amiga's dedicated graphics hardware. Step forward Chris Sawyer, who began by converting StarRay in 1988. Sawyer worked on many conversions to the PC: Virus, Xenomorph, Elite Plus, Dino Dini's Goal, and finally in 1993, Frontier Elite 2, a conversion which improved on the original with smooth frame rates and the addition of texture mapped graphics, plus a certain small advertisement in the space stations. By this time, Chris Sawyer was working up to 16 hours per day on his own transport game, something he titled Interactive Transport Simulation. Initial prototypes used simple developer art at the blocky 320x200 resolution that was normal for the time. But when Sawyer collaborated with artist Simon Foster to jazz up the appearance of ITS for its eventual publication by Microprose in 1994 as Transport Tycoon, he realised that chunky VGA was not going to do Foster's detailed buses and trains justice. With increasing numbers of 386 and 486 PCs on the market, with Super VGA cards as standard, Sawyer decided it would be viable to release a game that demanded a computer capable of 640 by 480. Of course, this was possible because of ultra-efficient assembly language code that not only squeezed the last possible drop of performance out of those CPUs, but also only drew the bare minimum necessary to update each frame. While other game developers were moving on to C or even C++, Transport Tycoon was still written entirely in assembly, and smoothly rendered larger and more complex worlds than any of its contemporaries. Microprose quickly followed up on the success of Transport Tycoon by packaging it with a scenario editor and special Martian graphics, before releasing an overhauled, improved version in 1995 as Transport Tycoon Deluxe. This introduced new climates, new vehicles, and most importantly the thing which has kept people playing the game to this day, one-way signals. A version for Windows 95 followed in 1996, and there was even a version for the PlayStation. With the definitive version of Transport Tycoon 1 on the market, Sawyer set to creating a sequel. One of the things he wanted to correct were the simplistic physics of the first game. In the sequel, vehicles would realistically slow down as they climbed bridges, or gain speed as they sped down hills. But one day, in a fit of serendipity, Chris tried using his new simulation engine to build a roller coaster, and a new franchise was born. White Knuckle was to be a new spin on the theme park management game. While Bullfrog's 1994 title Theme Park concentrated on detailed business simulations and contract negotiations, White Knuckle would streamline this section of the game and move the focus to building realistic, physically simulated roller coasters. Naturally, it was programmed in assembly. With PCs breaking the 200 and 300 MHz barrier, this meant an unprecedented level of detail and complexity, with the engine capable of modelling hundreds of guests and dozens of roller coasters in a single park. With the game mostly complete, Chris Sawyer set about looking for a publisher and landed again with Microprose, now owned by Hasbro Interactive. Hasbro wanted to capitalise on the legacy of Microprose's classic Tycoon titles, so once more added that T-word to the title. Roller Coaster Tycoon was launched in 1999 and once again introduced the Bressingham Voigt LP to the world. It was the year's best-selling game, and even wound up being included in cereal boxes. With so many copies of the base game in circulation, Hasbro spun off 2 expansion packs, added attractions, or corkscrew follies if you were in the US, added mini classic rides and challenging scenarios, while the second follow-up, Loopy Landscapes, also improved the core game with added quality of life features. In 2002 came the follow-up title, Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. Still programmed in assembler, it allowed the limits to be bumped up even higher to take advantage of new CPUs, with one scenario featuring a monstrous 4,500 guests. But it also received criticism for being little more than an expansion pack sequel. And while Simon Foster put some of his finest work into RCT2's combination of hand-drawn and pre-rendered sprites, there were grumblings about why the franchise hadn't expanded into 3D. With Infogrames looking to make even more cash on the franchise, 2 expansion packs were outsourced to Frontier Developments, the company founded by David Braben to release, of all things, the CD32 port of Frontier Elite 2. However, Wacky Worlds and Time Twister were little more than a few new scenarios with mere reskins of existing rides and ugly, overscale scenery that clashed with the carefully rendered Simon Foster originals. Even if the terrain was often better than the base game's over-reliance on the pyramid tool, neither went down well. Frontier would eventually get their own crack at the Roller Coaster Tycoon franchise with 2004's Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, and of course, their hugely successful independent title, Planet Coaster. Meanwhile, Chris Sawyer wanted to return to the idea of that Transport Tycoon sequel, using a Roller Coaster Tycoon-style engine to allow cliffs, rolling hills, and bridges and tunnels across multiple levels. Yet again he worked in x86 assembler. But by now computers were powerful enough that even games written in object-oriented languages such as C++ could feature thousands of objects with mini-complex interactions, and the abstractions introduced by such languages made those things easier to code and easier to keep track of. Chris Sawyer's Locomotion released in 2004 to little fanfare, publicity, or indeed popular critical reception. Long-standing fans of the Tycoon series bemoaned its lack of complexity and its fiddly vehicle management, while casual fans found the isometric graphics dated and ugly. It didn't help that Locomotion aimed for the excessively brown-toned realism that blighted minigames of the era. Not a good choice for a game with a 256 colour palette. Even Chris Sawyer himself would later rue that the game hadn't captured the same spirit of accessible fun as Transport Tycoon. Despite it being a complex programming achievement, he was immensely proud of behind the scenes. Unfortunately for lovers of isometric games, be they Rollercoaster Tycoon or Quogo, Sawyer was becoming disillusioned by a game industry that he saw as increasingly focused on large projects with teams of dozens of developers, and on violent games based mostly on men in jeeps shooting each other in the face. He had royalties from making smart business decisions around the publishing agreements for Rollercoaster Tycoon, and decided to retire from game making, other than occasionally offering advice to other developers on the continuation of the franchise. The reins of the Rollercoaster Tycoon franchise were given to Atari. Quite what happened to that is another story. But this is Chris Sawyer's story, and we haven't quite reached the end of it. As mobile games became increasingly popular, Sawyer saw some of the same small team independent spirit from the PC games of his earlier career, even if there wasn't to be any assembly language this time round. In 2013, Chris Sawyer teamed up with Originate to release Transport Tycoon for mobile. Confusingly, this was actually an adaptation of 2004's Locomotion, with the addition of touch controls and some minor updates. Despite this, it was well received enough for a follow-up attempt in 2016, this time bundling the two Rollercoaster Tycoon games and their add-ons into a single product called Rollercoaster Tycoon Classic. While third-party developers handled both projects, Chris had a strong influence on the games, including a determination that they were to be priced fairly and not be laden with microtransactions, adverts, or pay-to-win mechanics. In 2017, Rollercoaster Tycoon Classic came to PC, granting it the unique status of being the only Chris Sawyer game on PC not to be written in assembly language. But while this may be little more than a gentle remaster of RCT2, the legacy of Chris Sawyer's games live on, both in the open source recreations of OpenTTD, OpenRCT2, and OpenLoco, and also spiritual successors such as Planet Coaster and Transport Fever, the latter of which has some familiar soundtrack moments. Perhaps most important of all is that Chris Sawyer's legacy doesn't include the embarrassing collapse of a contrived rockstar persona like so many of his contemporaries. Instead, his career is marked by a series of beloved classic games, talented programming accomplishment, modesty, and a wonderfully simple website. Here's to you, Chris.